In the forgotten corner of a small, cluttered apartment that always seemed to smell faintly of cooked onions and old paper, a 16-year-old girl named Clara found her voice. It wasn't a voice you could hear with your ears, not in the way most people meant. She was quiet, almost invisible at school. A girl who learned to walk through hallways like a ghost. Her shoulders slightly hunched, her eyes fixed on the scuffed toes of her sneakers. She rarely raised her hand in class, and when a teacher called on her, her words would come out in a soft whisper, often getting lost before they reached the front of the room. But in the living room of that tiny apartment, surrounded by stacks of books and her mother's sewing projects, Clara had a language that was louder and more powerful than anything she could ever say. Her voice was in the chipped, yellowed keys of an old upright piano that had belonged to her grandmother. It was a beast of a thing, dark wood scarred with nicks and water rings. One of its pedals a bit sticky if you pressed it too hard. It had been moved into the apartment years ago, heavy reminder of a woman Clara barely remembered, but felt deeply connected to. While other kids her age were at the mall or hanging out at the park, Clara was at home, her fingers dancing across those 88 keys. She had no formal training, no teacher to guide her, and no sheet music to tell her what to do. All she had was a small, crackling radio that sat on top of the piano and a raw, hungry feeling inside her that demanded to be let out. She learned by listening. She would absorb everything that came through the radio's static, the mournful wail of a blues guitar, the complex layers of a classical symphony, the catchy hook of a pop song, the storytelling of an old folk ballad. She would hum the melodies until they were stuck in her head, and then she would hunt for them on the piano. Her fingers, though untrained and sometimes clumsy, seemed to have their own memory. They would search for the notes, finding them not by reading music but by feeling the shape of the sound in her mind. It was a slow, frustrating process, filled with wrong notes and chords that sounded like a cat in a fight. But every now and then, she would find it. She would find the perfect combination of notes that matched the feeling in her heart. And a beautiful, clear melody would bloom in the dusty air of her living room. In those moments, the world outside her window would fade away. The noisy street, the thin walls, the feeling of being invisible at school, it all disappeared. There was only her and the music. Her music was uniquely hers. It wasn't a perfect copy of anything she heard. It was a blend, a melting pot of all the sounds she loved. A simple melody she heard on the radio might become a stormy, complicated piece in her hands, full of deep, sad chords in the left hand and a hopeful, searching tune in the right. She didn't know about music theory or proper technique. She didn't hold her wrists the way she was supposed to. And she often used her own strange timing, speeding up and slowing down based on the emotion she wanted to convey. To a trained ear, it might have sounded messy, undisciplined. But to Clara, it was the truest thing in her life. It was the only place where she felt completely herself. Where the quiet girl in the corner of the classroom could be bold and passionate and brilliant. One afternoon, while waiting for the bus, she saw a tattered flyer stapled to a community board. The paper was faded and curled at the edges. But the words jumped out at her. Northwood Music Academy, Annual Scholarship Competition. Northwood was a name she knew. It was the most prestigious music school in the entire state, a place for rich kids with perfect posture and decades of lessons. The kind of place that felt like a different planet. She almost walked away. What was the point? They would laugh at someone like her. But then she read the fine print, open to all young musicians. Submit a video of an original composition. Her heart gave a little thump. She had dozens of those, stored away in her head and in her fingers. That night, an idea took root. It was a crazy, ridiculous idea. The kind of idea that makes you feel a little dizzy. What if she just tried? What if she recorded one of her songs and sent it in? They would probably throw it in the trash the second they saw it was filmed on a phone in a cluttered living room. But the what if was a powerful thing. It was a tiny spark of hope in a life that felt very dim. So, she did it. She propped her mother's old phone on a stack of books, pointed it at the piano, and took a deep breath. She played one of her favorite pieces, a song that started out small and lonely and grew into a powerful, soaring storm. The video was shaky. You could hear a bus rumble by outside. Her playing wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was full of everything she had. She hit send before she could talk herself out of it, and then tried her best to forget about it. For 2 weeks, she managed to push it to the back of her mind. She went to school, came home, and played her piano. But every time her computer made a notification sound, her heart would leap into her throat. Then, one Tuesday evening, an email arrived. The subject line read, "Northwood Music Academy Scholarship Application." Her hands trembled as she clicked it open. She read the first sentence once, then twice, then a third time, certain her eyes were playing tricks on her. "Dear Miss Clara," it began, "we are delighted to inform you that your application has been successful, and we would be honored to offer you a place at our academy for the upcoming school year." She stared at the screen, the words blurring through a sudden rush of tears. She, Clara, the invisible girl from the cluttered apartment, was going to Northwood. Walking into the Northwood Music Academy for the first time felt like stepping into another world. The air smelled of lemon polish and old wood, a clean, expensive scent that was nothing like her home. The floors were polished marble that reflected the light from tall, arched windows, and the hallways echoed with the sounds of confident, practiced music. Students walked by with sleek instrument cases, talking about composers and techniques she had never heard of. They all seemed so sure of themselves, so at home in this grand, intimidating place. Clara clutched the strap of her worn backpack, her simple sneakers feeling loud and clumsy on the silent floors. She felt like an imposter, like someone who had snuck into a party she wasn't invited to. She was a tiny, out-of-place note in a perfectly composed symphony, and she had a sinking feeling that everyone was about to hear how wrong she sounded. The first few weeks at the academy were a blur for Clara. She felt like a ghost drifting through a world of vibrant, living color. She would attend her classes music theory, history, ear training, and sit in the very back, trying to make herself as small as possible. The other students spoke a language she didn't understand, throwing around terms like counterpoint and legato with an ease that made her head spin. She would nod along, pretending she knew what they were talking about, but inside, she felt a growing panic. It was like she had been taught to read a different alphabet her whole life, and now she was suddenly expected to read Shakespeare. The only time she felt real was when she could sneak into an empty practice room late at night. When the building was quiet and she could play her own music without anyone listening, the moment she had been dreading finally arrived. Her first master class with Mr. Alistair Finch. His name was spoken in hushed, reverent tones in the hallways. He was a legend, a pianist who had performed in grand concert halls all over the world before deciding to teach. He was known for his sharp ear, his exacting standards, and his temper. Students were terrified of him, but they also desperately wanted his approval. The master class was held in a large, beautiful room with a high ceiling and windows that looked out onto a manicured garden. In the center of the room, on a slightly raised platform, sat a gleaming black Steinway grand piano that looked more like a work of art than a musical instrument. The students sat in a semicircle of expensive chairs, notebooks open, their postures perfect. Clara found a seat on the end, her worn jeans and simple sweater feeling painfully out of place. Mr. Finch entered the room without a sound. He was a tall, thin man with silver hair, combed neatly back from a high forehead, and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through you. He didn't smile. He walked to the piano, ran a long finger over the smooth surface, and then turned to face the students. "Today," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight, "we will be discussing discipline. We will be discussing respect. Batch's Etude number 3. A simple piece. A perfect piece to see if a student understands the meaning of control." He looked down at a list on his tablet. "Clara," he said, his eyes finding hers in an instant, "you will begin." Clara's heart jumped into her throat. Every pair of eyes in the room swiveled to look at her. Her legs felt like lead as she stood up and walked toward the piano. The short distance to the platform felt like the longest walk of her life. She could feel her palms sweating, and she wiped them nervously on her jeans. She sat on the bench, the cold leather sending a shiver up her spine. She placed her trembling fingers on the keys, the ivory cool and smooth beneath her touch. She took a deep breath, trying to remember the advice she had read in a book. Just breathe. Focus and play the notes as they are written. She began to play. The etude was a simple, elegant melody, meant to be played with precision and clarity. She started out fine, her fingers finding the right notes. But as she played, something happened. She couldn't just play the notes. The music had to mean something. Without even thinking about it, she started to pour her own feelings into the piece. The simple melody in her hands became a conversation. It was no longer just a series of notes. It was a story. It was the story of her loneliness, the ache of a question that had no answer. She held a note just a little longer than she was supposed to, letting it hang in the air with a hollow sadness. She softened a phrase, giving it a gentle, pleading quality. She was playing batch, but she was playing it through her own heart. When she finished the first section, she looked up at Mr. Finch, hoping for some sign of approval. But his face was a mask of cold fury. The room was completely silent, a heavy, suffocating silence that was somehow worse than any noise. "Stop," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a shard of glass. "Just stop." Clara's fingers froze on the keys. "Miss Bellamy," he continued, his voice dripping with a condescension that was far more painful than any shout. "What was that?" "I was playing the etude," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "No," he said, taking a step closer to the piano. "That was not Bach. That was a caricature. It was a cheap, sentimental imitation of music. You have no discipline. You have no respect for the composer. Bach did not write a feeling. He wrote notes. Precise, perfect notes. Your job is not to add your own little tragic story to it. Your job is to play the notes as they were written." A few students in the front row let out a little snicker, and Clara's face began to burn with a hot, prickling shame. Mr. Finch pointed to her hands. "Look at your wrists. They are sloppy. Your timing is all over the place. You speed up, you slow down. It's an embarrassment. It is not music. It is simply noise. You are banging on the keys like a child having a tantrum." He walked around the piano, his eyes never leaving her. "Where did you learn to play like this? Who taught you this? This mess?" "No one," Clara whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I taught myself." A small, cruel smile touched Mr. Finch's lips. "Ah," he said, as if that explained everything. "It is obvious. You have no foundation. You are a wild animal, and this is not a jungle. This is a place for art, for craft, for discipline." He waved a dismissive hand toward her. "Go back to your seat. And please, do us all a favor and stick to what you know, whatever that is. Classical music requires a soul, not just sentiment." Clara felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. She slowly stood up, her legs shaking so badly she was afraid they would give out. She couldn't look at anyone. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor as she walked back to her seat, the weight of every stare pressing down on her. The snickers from the front row seemed to echo in her head, growing louder and louder with each step. She finally reached her chair and sank into it, wanting the floor to open up and swallow her whole. She stared at her hands, resting in her lap, the same hands that had created such beautiful music in her living room. Now they felt useless, clumsy, and ashamed. A hot sting started behind her eyes, and she blinked rapidly, fighting back the tears. She would not cry. She would not let them see her cry. But as she sat there, listening to the next student play the Bach etude with cold, perfect precision, a heavy stone settled in her stomach. For the first time, she wondered if the mocking teacher was right. Maybe she didn't belong here. Maybe she was just a girl from a cluttered apartment, banging on the keys and nothing more. The days that followed the master class were the longest of Clara's life. The walk home that evening was a blur of gray streets and muffled sounds, the cold air feeling sharp against her hot, burning cheeks. Every word Mr. Finch had said echoed in her head, playing on a loop. Banging on the keys, an embarrassment, no discipline. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. When she finally got to her apartment, she didn't even turn on the lights. She just stood, in the middle of the living room, in the familiar clutter, and felt completely lost. The old upright piano, once her best friend in her sanctuary, now looked like a stranger. Its chipped keys and scarred wood seemed to mock her, reminding her of her clumsiness and her lack of real training. She walked over to it and sat on the worn bench, her fingers hovering over the keys, but they felt heavy, dead. She tried to play a simple melody, one of the first songs she had ever taught herself, but the notes came out stiff and wrong. The magic was gone. The connection she had always felt with the instrument had been severed, replaced by a painful self-consciousness. All she could hear was Mr. Finch's voice telling her she was a fraud. She slammed the keyboard lid down, the loud bang making her jump. For the first time in her life, the piano brought her no comfort at all. It only brought pain. That night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the decision forming in her mind with a cold, hard clarity. She would quit. It was the only sensible thing to do. She didn't belong at Northwood. She was a fool to ever think she could. The scholarship was a mistake, a clerical error they would soon correct. The thought brought a strange sense of relief. Quitting meant the pain would stop. It meant she would never have to face Mr. Finch again, never have to feel the snickering stares of her classmates, never have to sit in a room full of people who spoke a language she couldn't understand. She could go back to her old life, to being invisible. It would be quieter. It would be safer. The next day, she wrote a short, simple email to the Academy's administration. "Please accept my resignation from the program. Effective immediately," it read. "Thank you for the opportunity." She hit send before she could change her mind, a single tear rolling down her cheek as she did. She spent the rest of the day in a numb fog, packing up the few books and folders she had brought with her. Her plan was to go to the Academy one last time that evening, after most of the students and faculty had gone home, to clean out her locker and return her ID card. She wanted to slip in and out like a thief in the night, without saying goodbye to anyone. When she arrived, the Academy was a different place. Grand hallways, usually bustling with noise and energy, were silent and empty. The polished marble floors reflected the dim light from the wall sconces, creating long, eerie shadows. It felt like a museum, and she was the last exhibit. As she walked toward the row of lockers, her footsteps echoing in the quiet, she passed the entrance to the main auditorium. The heavy double doors were slightly ajar, and a soft, inviting light spilled out into the hallway. On an impulse, she pushed one of the doors open and peeked inside. The auditorium was vast and breathtakingly beautiful. Hundreds of empty red velvet seats faced a massive empty stage. In the center of the stage, under a single warm spotlight, sat the concert grand piano. It was a monster of black lacquer and gleaming white ivory, the most magnificent piano she had ever seen. It looked powerful, important, forgetting her locker, forgetting her plan to leave. Clara found herself walking down the aisle, her feet silent on the thick carpet. She climbed the steps onto the stage and approached the piano as if it were a sleeping creature. She sat on the bench. The plush velvet, a stark contrast to the hard wood of her own piano bench at home. She placed her fingers on the keys, and the touch was incredible, responsive, sensitive, alive. She had intended to just play one note, to feel the vibration, but then something else took over. She didn't play Bach or Beethoven or any of the composers she was supposed to be learning. She closed her eyes, and the music that lived inside her, the music she had been too ashamed to let out, came pouring forth. It started as a whisper, a single lonely note hanging in the vast empty space. Then another note joined it, and another, weaving together into a hesitant, questioning melody. It was the sound of her confusion, her hurt. The melody grew, becoming stronger, more insistent. It was the sound of her anger at Mr. Finch, at his cruel words and his cold, dismissive eyes. Her left hand began to add deep, rumbling chords, like a gathering storm. The music swelled into a tempest of sound, a cascade of powerful, frantic notes that filled the entire auditorium. It was the sound of her humiliation, her frustration, her feeling of being trapped and misunderstood. It was a scream of defiance, a raw and beautiful cry from the depths of her soul. She played with everything she had, her body swaying, her fingers flying across the keys, pouring every ounce of her pain and passion into the music. When she finally struck the final thundering chord, The sound echoed through the hall and then faded into a profound, heavy silence. Clara sat there, breathing heavily, her heart pounding in her chest. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but this time, it wasn't a tear of shame. It was a tear of release. "That was some playing," a soft, raspy voice said from the back of the auditorium. Clara jumped, her eyes flying open. She spun around on the bench, her heart leaping into her throat. Standing in the aisle near the back, Rose was an old man in a gray janitor's uniform, leaning on a wide broom. He had kind, wrinkled eyes and a face that looked like it had spent a lot of time smiling. He must have come in while she was playing, and she had been so lost in the music that she never heard him. I'm sorry," she stammered, her face flushing. "I was just leaving." The man shook his head, a gentle smile on his lips. "Don't be sorry on my account. My wife, she would have loved that." He took a few steps closer, his broom making a soft swishing sound on the carpet. "She was a concert pianist, you know. Played all over the world before she got sick." Clara just stared at him, not knowing what to say. "They teach you the rules in a place like this," he continued, his voice thoughtful. "The scales, the timing, the way you're supposed to hold your hands, the exact way a composer intended a piece to be played. And those things are important, I guess. They give you the tools, but they forget to tell you something." He stopped and looked directly at her, his eyes surprisingly bright. "They forget to tell you that the greatest music, the music that really makes you feel something, it happens when you have the courage to break those rules." He gestured toward the piano. "What you just played that had more life in it than 100 perfect Bach etudes? It was real. It was you." He smiled again, a sad, knowing smile. "My wife used to say that technique was just the hammer and nails. But the music was the house you built with them. You can't live in the hammer and nails." He tapped his broom on the floor. "Don't let them sand down your edges, kid. That's where the light gets in." And with that, he gave her a small nod, turned, and continued his quiet sweeping, disappearing into the shadows of the far side of the auditorium. Clara sat there for a long time, his words echoing in her mind. "Don't let them sand down your edges. That's where the light gets in." The heavy stone of shame in her stomach felt a little lighter. The thought of quitting no longer felt like a relief. It felt like a defeat. A new idea began to spark in the back of her mind. A dangerous, thrilling idea. She looked at the stage, at the magnificent piano under the spotlight. She wasn't going to disappear. She was going to make them listen. The old man's words, "Don't let them sand down your edges. That's where the light gets in," echoed in Clara's mind long after she left the auditorium. They were a small, quiet spark in the vast dark space of her humiliation. As she walked through the silent, empty hallways of the academy, the spark grew into a flicker, then a steady flame. She stopped at her locker, but she didn't open it. Instead, she turned and walked back the way she came, her steps no longer hesitant but filled with a new purpose. She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. She found the email she had sent earlier that day, the one of defeat. With a deep breath, she opened a new message to the same administrator. "Please disregard my previous email," she typed. "I will be continuing my studies at the academy. Thank you." Hitting send felt like a declaration of war. The next morning, Clara walked into the academy with her head held a little higher. The shame was still there, a dull ache in her chest, but it was no longer paralyzing. It had been transformed into something else, fuel. As she walked past the main bulletin board, a large, colorful poster caught her eye. It was for the annual Winter Showcase, the Academy's biggest competition. Students would perform in front of the entire school, a panel of judges, and invited guests from the city's music scene. And at the very top of the judges' list was a name that made her stomach clench, Mr. Alistair Finch. A plan, bold and terrifying, began to form in her mind. This was it. This was her chance. Not to prove she could play Bach perfectly, but to prove that her music, the music that lived inside her, was worth hearing. She decided she would not play the assigned classical piece. She would play her own. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. It went against every rule of the academy. But the janitor's words gave her courage. The rules were just tools. She was going to build a house. She spent the next few days sketching out ideas in a worn notebook. Not with musical notation, which she barely understood, but with words and feelings. Start small, lonely, she wrote. Like being ignored, then build. Anger, like a storm. Hope, light breaking through clouds. She was composing a story, and the story was her own. Her work had to be done in secret. She couldn't practice in the main practice rooms during the day, where the sound would travel through the thin walls and invite more mockery. So, she became a creature of the night. She would wait until the last student had left, till the only sounds were the hum of the lights and the distant rumble of the cleaning cart. Then she would slip into the empty auditorium, her sanctuary. The concert grand piano became her closest confidant. In the beginning, it was frustrating. The music in her head was so big, so complex, and her fingers struggled to keep up. There were nights she wanted to scream, nights where a passage would sound clumsy and wrong, and the old doubts would creep back in. But she pushed through. Driven by the memory of Mr. Finch's cruel smile and the janitor's kind eyes, after a few weeks, she noticed she wasn't entirely alone. The old janitor would often be sweeping in the back rows when she arrived. He never interrupted. He would just find a seat in the shadows, lean his broom against a wall, and listen. One night, during a short break, she worked up the nerve to talk to him. "Thank you for not kicking me out," she said softly. He chuckled, a warm, raspy sound. "Wouldn't dream of it. My name's Elias, by the way. I'm Clara," she replied. "I know," he said with a gentle smile. "You're the one who makes the building feel alive after midnight." From then on, it became their ritual. She would play, and he would listen. He never offered technical advice. He didn't have to. His presence was enough. It was the first time she had ever played for an audience who was there just to listen without judgment. He became her anchor, silent witness to her transformation. She poured everything into the composition, which she secretly named Unheard. It was the most difficult thing she had ever created. It began with a simple, hesitant melody in a minor key. The notes spaced far apart, capturing the feeling of her isolation and loneliness at the academy. Then, the music would shift. A low, rumbling bass line would introduce a sense of conflict. Building into a furious cascade of dissonant chords and frantic complex runs in the right hand, this was her anger, her humiliation, her fight against the voices that told her she wasn't good enough. It was chaotic and raw, but there was a pattern to it, a story being told in the storm. But the piece didn't end there. From the chaos, a new melody would slowly emerge. It was a variation of the initial theme, but stronger, more resilient. It was played with a steady driving rhythm, a refusal to be beaten down. And then, for the final section, the music would break through into a major key. The melody would soar, clear and bright, full of a powerful, defiant hope. It was the sound of finding her own voice, the sound of light breaking through. It was technically demanding, requiring a strength and precision she didn't know she possessed. But it was also deeply, painfully personal, as the weeks turned into a month. The day of the showcase drew closer. During the day, Clara continued to be the invisible girl in the back of the classroom. Mr. Finch still ignored her. The other students still whispered, but it didn't bother her as much. She had a secret world they knew nothing about. She had a fortress of music that they couldn't touch. She would walk through the hallways, the sound of Unheard playing in her head. A constant, powerful reminder of what she was about to do. The night before the competition, Clara stayed later than ever. The auditorium was completely dark, except for the single spotlight on the piano. Elias was in his usual seat. She played Unheard from beginning to end, not stopping once. Her fingers flew across the keys, the music filling the vast space with all the passion and power she had poured into it. When she struck the final triumphant chord, she let it hang in the air, vibrating with a life of its own. She turned to look at Elias. He was standing, and in the dim light, she could see that his face was wet with tears. He didn't say anything. He just nodded slowly, a single profound gesture of respect and understanding. It was all the approval she needed. Clara closed the piano lid, her heart calm and steady for the first time in months. She was ready. Tomorrow, they would finally hear her. The night of the winter showcase arrived, and the air inside the academy was thick with a nervous energy that felt like electricity. The grand hall, usually a place of quiet study, was transformed. Bright lights illuminated a stage adorned with elegant flowers, and the seats were filling up quickly with students, faculty, and important-looking guests from the city. Clara stood in the wings, peeking through a small gap in the heavy velvet curtain. Her heart wasn't pounding with the same frantic fear she had felt during her masterclass. Instead, there was a calm, steady hum inside her, a quiet sense of purpose. She had done the work. She had poured her soul into the keys of that piano night after night. Tonight was not about winning or losing. It was about speaking her truth and letting the sound of it fill the room. The show began. One by one, students walked onto the stage, their backs straight, their expressions serious. They played their assigned pieces with a stunning technical perfection. A girl with a violin performed a Mozart concerto that was so clean and precise it was like listening to a perfect recording. A boy with a cello played a Bach suite that was full of controlled intellectual beauty. Each performance was met with polite, respectful applause. It was the kind of applause you give when you recognize skill and hard work. But it didn't feel alive. It was the sound of appreciation, not of connection. Clara watched them, and she understood. They were all playing the notes perfectly, just as they had been taught. They were following the rules. Then, a voice from the announcer's table cut through the quiet. And now, performing an original composition, we have Clara Bellamy. A murmur went through the audience. An original composition? From the quiet girl in the back of the theory class? A few people shifted in their seats, exchanging curious glances. On the judging panel, Mr. Finch didn't even look up from the program he was reading. A small, dismissive smirk played on his lips. He had already written her off. Clara took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The lights were bright, almost blinding, and she couldn't see the faces in the crowd, which was a relief. She just saw a sea of dark shapes. She walked to the center of the stage and sat at the concert grand piano. The polished wood felt cool under her fingers. For a moment, she just sat there, the silence of the hall pressing in on her. She thought of Elias, sitting somewhere in the back, and of his words, "That's where the light gets in." She closed her eyes and began to play. The first notes were so quiet they were almost a whisper. A simple, lonely melody hung in the air, fragile and hesitant. It wasn't a showy start. It wasn't designed to impress. It was designed to make you feel. It was the sound of being alone in a crowded room. The sound of a question that has no answer. The audience leaned in, caught off guard by the raw vulnerability of it. This was not the flawless, confident music they had been hearing all night. This was something else entirely. Then the music began to shift. A low, rumbling chord from the left hand introduced a sense of conflict, a gathering darkness. The simple melody began to twist and change, becoming more urgent, more complex. Suddenly, the music erupted. It was a tempest of sound, a furious cascade of dissonant chords and frantic, lightning-fast runs that seemed to chase each other up and down the keyboard. Clara's body was swaying now, her fingers flying across the keys with a power and aggression that was startling to watch. This was the sound of her anger, her humiliation. It was the storm of emotions she had kept locked away for months. You could hear the mockery in the sharp stabbing notes and the frustration in the chaotic swirling rhythms. The audience was completely still, captivated. They weren't just hearing a performance. They were experiencing a story. A woman in the third row put a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. A man in the front row leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. They were feeling her pain. But just as the storm reached its peak, something incredible happened. From the chaos, a new melody began to emerge. It was a variation of the initial lonely theme, but it was stronger now, more determined. It fought its way through the dissonance, clear and bright. The angry chords in the left hand softened, becoming a steady, driving pulse like a heartbeat refusing to give up. The music was no longer about fighting against something. It was about fighting for something. It was the sound of resilience, of finding strength in the struggle. The tension in the hall began to lift, replaced by a sense of awe and wonder. Then, For the final section, the music broke through into a major key, and the entire auditorium seemed to brighten. The melody soared, free and triumphant. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated hope. It was the sound of a girl who had been told she was nothing, discovering she was everything. It was the sound of light breaking through the clouds. Clara played the final passage with a joy and a passion that was breathtaking, her hands dancing across the keys, a smile touching her lips for the first time that night. She brought the piece to a close with a series of powerful, ringing chords that filled the hall with a sense of victory and release. When she struck the final chord, she let it hang in the air, vibrating with a life of its own. Then there was silence. It wasn't the polite, waiting silence from before. It was a profound, absolute silence, the kind that happens when something truly magical has just occurred. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath, letting the emotion of the music sink in. Clara sat at the piano, her chest heaving, her hands resting on the keys. In that silence, she knew she had done it. She had made them listen. Then, a single person in the back row began to clap. It was Elias. Then another person joined in, and another. Suddenly, the entire hall erupted in a thunderous, explosive wave of applause. It wasn't polite or respectful. It was loud and joyous and overwhelming. People were on their feet, the entire crowd, standing and cheering and shouting bravo. A few people were wiping tears from their eyes. The sound was so powerful it seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. On the judging panel, Mr. Finch was frozen. His program had slipped from his lap and lay on the floor forgotten. He was staring at Clara, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The smirk was gone, replaced by a look of dawning disbelief. He wasn't looking at a rule breaker or a sentimental amateur anymore. He was looking at an artist. He was seeing the raw, untamed talent he had so cruelly mocked, and he was finally understanding it. He was seeing that the soul she had wasn't a replacement for technique. It was the very thing that made the music matter. Clara slowly stood up and turned to face the audience. The wall of sound hit her, and for a moment, she felt dizzy. She saw the standing ovation, the tear-streaked faces, the looks of pure admiration. She searched the crowd and found Elias in the back, standing proudly, his broom leaning against the wall next to him. He gave her a small, knowing nod, and she smiled, a real genuine smile that reached all the way to her eyes. In that moment, she wasn't the invisible girl from the cluttered apartment anymore. She wasn't the student who had been publicly humiliated. She was Clara, and everyone in the room finally knew her name.